And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Let's dive into really the biggest story of the day. Remember this major story in the Atlantic magazine. The material, remember, in this text chain on the Signal messaging app that the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic was invited into inadvertently, his name, Jeffrey Goldberg. Well, it, quote, contained operational details of forthcoming strikes on Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen, including information about targets, weapons the U.S. would be deploying, and attack sequencing here. Last hour, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth commented on the story as he landed in Hawaii. Let's watch.
Hey, you give me the thumbs up when you're done.
I'll tell you something, this is a trip.
Give us 1 second.
We had,
Good?
I'll tell you something, this is a trip we've had circled on the calendar from the beginning. The Indo-Pacific, shifting priorities to make sure we're deterring threats to the future. President Trump's been focused on that. Reestablishing the warrior ethos, rebuilding our military, and ultimately reestablishing deterrence is critically important. And so we're out here to talk to our commanders and, more importantly, meet with the troops all across the Indo-Pacific, and then our allies and partners, too, who are going to be a critical part of ensuring the future in this region is free. And so we're glad to be here. It's a beautiful day. Had a full work day on the plane. Now we've got a full work day here as well, and looking forward to it.
Mr. Secretary, can you share how your information about war plans against the Houthis in Yemen was shared with a journalist in the Atlantic? And were those details classified?
You're talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again, to include the hoaxes of Russia, or the fine people on both sides hoax, or suckers and losers hoax. So this is the guy that peddles in garbage. This is what he does. I would love to comment on the Houthi campaign because of the skill and courage of our troops. I've monitored it very closely from the beginning. And you see, we've been managing 4 years of deferred maintenance under the Trump administration. Our troops, our sailors were getting shot at as targets. Our ships couldn't sail through. And when they did shoot back, it was purely defensively or at shacks in Yemen. President Trump said, no more. We will reestablish deterrence. We will open freedom of navigation, and we will ultimately decimate the Houthis, which is exactly what we're doing as we speak from the beginning, overwhelmingly.
Why were those details shared on Signal, and how did you learn that a journalist was privy to the targets, the types of weapons used?
I've heard I was characterized. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
That's it. The NSC said it's contingent.
And again, want to reiterate, because Hegseth is reiterating, no one, he says, was texting war plans. Well, this was the statement from National Security Council spokesperson Brian Hughes. He says, at this time, the message thread that was reported appears to be authentic. And we are reviewing how an inadvertent number was added to the chain. The thread is a demonstration of the deep and thoughtful policy coordination between senior officials. The ongoing success of the Houthi operation demonstrates that there were no threats to our service members or our national security there. So we want to talk about all of this even further here. I want to bring into the conversation national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, good to see you. I hope you had a good weekend here. Did not anticipate covering a story of this magnitude on a Monday nonetheless, but here we are. And I have to ask, Hal, because this is not a leak in the traditional sense, and that's why I feel weird calling it a leak. But what did you make of Hegseth's comments there responding to this story? Did he do any good effort to allay or alleviate concerns about what transpired on that Signal group chat?
Simply on what I heard him say, I didn't hear denial. He attacked Jeffrey Goldberg, kind of attacked the Atlantic. He talked about, Russia, other things in the past, which I'm not sure some of those things were completely put to rest, so to speak. But then he said, and it was a very specific denial that war plans were not texted. All right, that's a very specific thing. I thought he kind of chose his words carefully there. I don't think the war plans themselves, the orders, if you will, the execution orders or anything like that were texted, but they're certainly, based on what Jeffrey Goldberg has relayed, there was a number of things in there which were basically operational details, in terms of what weapon systems are going to be used, when they're going to be used, what the targets were. It sounds like some of the platforms were discussed in terms of how what was going to deliver those things. So in that regard, stuff that I would have considered at least secret, I won't jump. There have been some who said this is top secret and everything. I don't know if it's top secret. I got to tell you, I've been doing intelligence stuff for a very long time, for many years, and this is the sort of stuff that normally is kept at a little bit lower level because it's operational. So it'd be secret stuff, but the idea that they're doing it on a unclassified, message app called Signal, which is really stunning. But I would like to.
So, Hal, wait. So, Hal, just to clarify. So, the information included in Jeffrey Goldberg's report, to which he doesn't include a lot, and he tells the reader that he doesn't include a lot of the classified information. He just describes it as this information about targets, weapons the U.S. would be deploying, and attack sequencing. Is that in and of itself classified?
Normally, that would be considered secret. Now, there is it would be classified. Now, with that said, it was brought up that some of the people involved, the vice president was on this, according to Jeffrey Goldberg, the vice president was on this app. You haven't heard denial from the White House on it, so it sounds authentic. The Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State was on this, Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor, and others were on this app, that they were talking about these details. Normally, things like that are classified. However, there is a certain truth that when you get to that level, you could make an argument that they have the power to declassify whatever they're talking about. So technically, if it was ever to come to it, they could say, hey, look, we have the authority or delegated authority to declassify whatever we're talking about. So that's a little bit different than saying someone who's in the military that would do something like this. And frankly, we have prosecuted people in the military. I remind you of Airman Teixeira, put a lot of stuff out there in the public domain with very severe consequences. At that level, it's unambiguous. At this level, I don't think it's particularly ambiguous, but I do think there is a shade of difference in that you're talking about the level of people in there. I would point out one thing, though, and I think this may be because it's at the beginning of the administration. This is a administration that, last year was running for office and then was in the midst of a transition. And in that regard, they're looking for a way to communicate securely. And it's going to be commercial means because they're not the government when they're running for office. So it would make sense of all the different apps out there. Signal is probably more secure than the others, and it would make sense for them to rely on a secure means. It may be this is a bad habit of communicating on Signal that kind of moved into when they were in office. This is stuff that should have been talked about in a secure facility like a SCIF, or on some of the highly classified systems that we have. You could text, but you don't do this in this way. This is just, I've never seen anything like this.
So if you were organizing the attacks against the Houthis, you would have had this conversation in person, not on Signal. Is that what you're alluding to, Hal?
In the past, I don't know. I think the fair thing to say is in the past, something like this would be something you'd see maybe in the Situation Room in the White House with the National Security Council. Although you could do it, there are chat features like anything else. It's fairly robust what we have in the federal government for secure communications. We have stuff that can be done at certainly this level, secret level classification, and stuff that can be done at a much higher level of classification. And they could have done texting. It would have been probably a little less user friendly because you have to go someplace and get on a terminal. Whereas with Signal, you can just do it on your cell phone like you do everything else on your cell phone, which makes it very easy. It's just not very secure.
So, Hal, I think a lot of people coming to this story are scratching their heads. I know I am. Is this how it's done? Is this how major military operations against Iranian terror proxies, going after them, is this how the collaboration and planning is done via a group chat? Because these attacks against the Houthis, these targeting of the Houthis, they're still ongoing. And the White House has been describing them as successful and effective, as has the Pentagon here. And what are the chances that any of our enemies, foreign and domestic, were surveilling or could surveil a group chat like that with high-level national security officials in a presidential administration? Are you concerned about that others could have been looking at that? I know when we describe this as a leak, it is somewhat not accurate to say that, because in the traditional sense, a leak is something that, you are given by a third party, probably anonymously. Jeffrey Goldberg was inadvertently invited into the group chat itself. So I think calling it a leak is somewhat of a misnomer.
It's not really a leak. It is a breach. It's a breach of security that, there's a couple things. Yes. To my knowledge, Signal, and I don't have specifics on it, but I have it on pretty good sources. Signal has been intercepted, breached, if you will, by foreign intelligence services. I think in that conversation, China and Russia came up. I don't know if Iran could. Certainly, if Iran had gotten this, they could have passed that directly over to the Houthis. I think if China or Russia got it, they could have passed it to Iran, or they could have passed it directly to the Houthis themselves. But in any of those cases, yes, this is sensitive information. If you're flying a strike mission, the last thing you want to know, or the last thing you want to think about, is that the Houthis have a reasonable chance of knowing that you're coming. They do have air defense systems, and if they know where you're coming from, what you're flying, or whatever you're doing, they can figure out ways to try and intercept you, or they can attack the platforms you came from. There's a lot of different things they could do. So yes, this is a very insecure way of doing that. It's very strange to hear this whole thing being done in such a manner. Now,
so, Hal,
go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this. I'm getting this question a lot. Well, why wasn't President Trump on this group chat?
Well, you usually keep. I'll just say this is organizational dynamics. When you have somebody like the president or the CEO of a mega billion-dollar corporation or something, there's a lot of discussion that will go on. And frankly, I would say in today's age, if you were to go back, say, 15 years ago, no, you probably wouldn't see something like this because it would be impractical. It couldn't really be done 15 years ago. So you just wouldn't see this. Although I will tell you that on classified systems, I have seen lively exchanges in email, classified email like this. And I know, and I've seen chat. There are chat functions on our systems where we actually do discuss stuff like this in a very classified environment,
right?
Not specific. So the idea of the principles or this level discussing something of this nature in such a candid, frank way, and there were some rather interesting observations that came out of this. I think the ones regarding Europe are probably the most fascinating things that came out of this whole thing. But a frank discussion like that, it happens. There is discussion like that. Not on a commercial message app, though. That's what's really strange. And generally speaking, when talking about highly classified military operations, you try not to include the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic or any other major media operation in your discussions. That's usually bad form, if you know what I mean. So
yeah, I mean, there's some kind of theorizing out there that Jeffrey Goldberg, JG, same initials as Jamison Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, of course. The U.S. Trade Representative in any conversation of any action against the Houthis, no doubt would probably want to know or be in the know, since the Houthis have disrupted so much of the global supply chain and global shipping there in the Red Sea with their attacks. So that's just a theory that hasn't been corroborated or confirmed just yet. I wanted to put that out there, though. Hal, but when Secretary Hegseth says no one was texting war plans, well, what does he mean? Is that accurate? Weren't they?
Well, that's why I say, look, we just have what he said when he landed Hickam Air Force Base over in Oahu. So I can't put too much more analysis on this than what I just saw. But when he says no one was texting war plans, basically he's saying nobody was texting the war plans. In other words, if you had something that said plans or planning order or execution order or something like that, that was not being texted. And those documents do exist. You don't have an operation like this without those things having been developed. What we call plano or an exord, planning order or an execution order or something like that. those would all be done, and those did not get texted over Signal.
Yeah.
By the way, if those did get texted over Signal, that would have been a very, very serious breach because those things very clearly have, secret, no foreign, which means secret, you cannot pass to foreign government sort of stuff on it. So that would have been very, very clear. There would have been no question about this. The fact they were talking about details of strike missions and stuff like that, to me, I think the breach is probably the best way to describe it. That's just stuff you don't talk about. I will tell you in the past, though, people, look, Washington, D.C. is kind of an interesting place. People talk about stuff that they probably shouldn't talk about in all sorts of spaces. Sometimes they say things that they shouldn't talk about, and there's cocktails involved and things like that. So, look, stuff gets picked up all over the place that probably shouldn't be talked about in those spaces. So I just want to say that, it's not the first time that information has gotten out there. This is the first time I've ever seen anything done quite like this. But I do think, of all the hypotheses of how it could happen, I think this may just be a bad habit that they got into coming out of the election and the transition. There's it's so easy. You just get on your phone, you hit the Signal app, and you just talk, and they probably kept talking, and then they started drifting into stuff that they shouldn't have been talking about.
So, Hal, if you're Hegseth or Mike Waltz or Rubio or some of these other individuals here, in a weird sense, it could have been worse. I mean, if it was someone who was more adversarial to them, to the Trump administration, the integrity of the mission against the Houthis could have been compromised. I mean, Jeffrey Goldberg waited until the strikes began. He waited a week later. He took himself off the group chat. He didn't disclose more classified information that he no doubt was privy to in these group chats. So, I'm trying to say glass half full here, maybe.
I think he was being pretty responsible. I mean, first off, he didn't, and I got to tell you, I'm someone who gets invitations for stuff that I see as clearly trolling or something like that. They see me on LiveNOW or something else, and they send something that's like, hey, and it's obviously not what it appears to be. And that's what he took this at. I mean, first off, he gets invited to this group. He sees all these names. And his first thought, which I thought was a good thought, was this isn't real. This is a very elaborate scheme that they're trying to pull me in on or something like that. So he's observing it. He's not saying anything, but he's thinking, okay, it's not real. It's not real. Then they start talking about the strike mission coming up. I think it was within about 2 hours of the strike mission. And he's still thinking, okay, well, we'll see if anything actually happens. And then when bombs started landing, and at the exact time that they said, he goes, oh my, this actually might be real. And so, part of that was his reluctance to really say anything because he thought this was some elaborate hoax that they were trying to pull him in on. I mean, he is the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic, so that would be a likely target if you're putting out disinformation or something like that. And I'm sure there's some out there who probably think, well, maybe this was an elaborate disinformation thing, or this was an elaborate information operation.
Yeah.
Again, I go back to some of the comments about the Europeans in this thing. I'm like, if this was an elaborate information operation to shift opinion in Europe, I have to say it's interesting.
Sure.
I don't think it's particularly a great way of doing it, but it was certainly interesting if that was a big scheme or something. But I think that's what it was. And then he saw it was real, and then he said, look, I got to get myself out of here. And he did hold back on putting out anything that he felt was a highly sensitive nature, like weapon system strike plans, stuff like that. He was very careful about that. But I'm sure there's a number of people in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere right now just, basically hitting their forehead going, how did we do this?
Sure.
And by the way, I would imagine right now there's a lot less sensitive chats by high government officials on Signal or WhatsApp or anything else. I'm sure they're all going back saying, okay, whatever was convenient, let's quit doing that.
All right, Hal Kempfer, we're going to have to leave it at that. Hal, wanted to get you on for this major story. Thanks for bringing us your insight. We'll talk soon.